Hi everybody. Wherever you are, snuggled in a warm bed, perhaps with the gentle hum of a fan or the soft whisper of rain outside your window, I'd like to invite you on a quiet, unhurried journey. Not a grand adventure with high stakes or drama, but something softer, more reflective. Tonight, we're sailing back in time to visit a world that no longer exists. We're going to take a slow walk through the creaking corridors and warm kitchens of the RMS Titanic. Not from the polished floors of first class, but from the simple wooden tables and iron bed frames of third class, or as it was officially, called steerage. The Titanic is often remembered as a symbol of opulence. Golden chandeliers, grand staircases, dining rooms that served 10 courses on white linen. But far below those shining halls, tucked beneath the decks, lived hundreds of people whose lives were very different, and perhaps far more interesting. Tonight, we're not telling a story of tragedy. We're not sailing toward the iceberg. Not yet, and maybe not at all. No. This is the story of life aboard the ship before it became legend. The story of bread and stew, of teacups and laughter, of families dreaming across the Atlantic. The Titanic carried more than just passengers. It carried thousands of tiny hopes, little routines, old recipes, new friendships, and quiet moments at sea. Third class was the cheapest way to cross the ocean. It was where young men with calloused hands and threadbare coats dreamed of building homes in Chicago or Calgary. It was where young women held their siblings close and whispered about marriage, jobs, and maybe new dresses. It was noisy, it was lively, and it was very much alive. In this story, we won't be rushing. We'll walk gently through each day, listen to the creak of the floors, the splash of dishwater, the clatter of cutlery. We'll meet the cooks and the children, hear conversations in Irish, Italian, Swedish, and see what people really ate. What they loved, what they grumbled about, and what they remembered. Before we start exploring, let's step back for a moment. It's April 1912. Europe is bustling, filled with noise, horses, smoke, prayers, and the rumble of trains. The world is teetering on the edge of great change, though few know it. Men wear hats that now look impossibly formal. Women's skirts still sweep the ground. Most people have never touched a telephone, and across the Atlantic, the so-called New World is calling, loudly. America is booming. Canada promises farmland. Jobs wait in factories and on railroads. And for many, especially from rural Ireland, Eastern Europe, and the Nordic countries, the Titanic is more than a ship. It is the first step toward a new life, a passage not only across the ocean, but out of poverty. Third-class tickets were affordable, relatively. Many families sold livestock, borrowed money, or scraped together savings over years to afford one. A third-class cabin wasn't luxurious, but it was cleaner and more comfortable than what most passengers were used to at home. And more importantly, it came with 3 hot meals a day, something not guaranteed in their daily lives back home. This is what makes our story so quietly remarkable. Imagine, you've grown up eating cold bread, potatoes, and cabbage. Maybe there were days you skipped meals altogether, and now suddenly you're aboard a floating palace with real silverware, a dining saloon lit by electric light, and warm pea soup for lunch. Of course, not everything was perfect. Far from it. Steerage was crowded, noisy, and not exactly a sanctuary, but it had its charms, and food, simple, hearty, and hot, was at the center of life below decks. In this series, we'll discover what a day in third class tasted like. We'll walk through the narrow passageways to the dining saloon. We'll look at menus, talk to imaginary passengers, and peek behind the scenes into the kitchens. We'll follow the sound of the dinner bell, sit at a table worn smooth by elbows, and laughter, and share a meal with strangers who might become friends. And don't worry, we won't hurry. This isn't a race to the end. You can fall asleep halfway through and join us again tomorrow. Our voyage will wait for you. Each part of our story will unfold like a slow-turning page in a long-forgotten book. We'll meet characters who never made it into the history books. A young widow from Cork with 4 children and a tin of biscuits. A shy farmer from northern Sweden with a suitcase full of seeds. A boy who swore he saw a whale through a porthole, though no one believed him. None of them are famous. All of them mattered. So pull up your blankets, let your body relax, Let your breathing slow, like the rocking of the sea beneath a ship at night. You're safe, you're warm, and our story is just beginning. Next, we'll walk you through the experience of buying a third-class ticket. We'll explore the emotions, the prices, the decision-making, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this voyage would change everything. For now, just picture it. A young couple clutching paper tickets, standing beside a worn suitcase, looking up at the massive iron hull of a ship so tall it blocks the morning sun. They're smiling, nervous. They have no idea what's ahead. But for the first time in a long time, they've eaten a good breakfast. It always began with a decision. Not the decision to leave home. No, that had already been brewing in quiet hearts for months, sometimes years. The real turning point was something far smaller and far more concrete. A slip of paper, handwritten, in ink, stamped in blue, folded neatly into a coat pocket. A ticket. A steerage ticket for passage aboard the RMS Titanic. To understand just how much this piece of paper meant, we have to go back to the parishes, the farms, and the cobbled streets of early 20th century Europe. In places like Ballymena, in Northern Ireland, or the tiny Swedish village of Leksand, or the overgrown fields outside Krakow, a third-class ticket aboard a ship like the Titanic was more than a travel document. It was a lifeline. Steerage class, often spoken of in hushed, almost pitiful tones today, was in fact a small miracle for many. On older ships, steerage passengers were housed like cargo, left to bring their own bedding, cook their own food, and sleep in conditions that rivaled livestock pens. But Titanic's third class was different, much different. White Star Line, the company behind the Titanic, wanted to compete not just in luxury but in comfort for the masses. They boasted about how clean and modern their third-class accommodations were. There were real beds, bunks with sheets and pillows, separate dining saloons for meals, fresh air via ventilators, even shared lavatories with running water. This wasn't just a ship, it was a floating promise. But let's return to that ticket. A third-class ticket aboard the Titanic in 1912 cost around $7 to $9, depending on the departure point and destination. That's roughly $35.40 USD at the time, not a fortune, but for many, the equivalent of several months' wages. To afford it, families sold cows, they pawned heirlooms, they pooled money from cousins already living in Boston or Winnipeg. Some even paid in installments to shipping agents who traveled from village to village, clutching brochures with drawings of the unsinkable ship. Buying a ticket wasn't just a financial act, it was an emotional one. It was usually done with trembling fingers, sometimes with a priest's blessing, sometimes with tears in the eyes of a mother who knew she might never see her child again. Because while the destination was hopeful, the journey was often one way. One such buyer, a fictional but entirely plausible man named Tomasz Nowak, aging 29, stood in line at a steamship office in Warsaw. He was a tailor's apprentice. His hands were always speckled with chalk, and he dreamed of opening a shop in Chicago, where the winters were brutal, yes, but the pay was fair. He didn't speak English, not yet, but he knew the word ticket, and he practiced it often in front of a cracked mirror. When he finally received it, folded crisply, marked RMS Titanic, April 10th, 1912, Steerage, Southampton to New York, he smiled as if he'd been handed gold. In a way, he had. That ticket was more than paper. It was a certificate of intent, a contract with the unknown. Now, imagine the logistics. Third-class passengers didn't always board directly in Southampton, England. Some joined from Queenstown, Ireland. Others came through Cherbourg, France. There were feeder ships that carried them across coasts and train routes arranged by shipping agents. Each part of the journey was orchestrated like a long, slow overture before the main symphony began. Let's pause for a moment. Picture an elderly woman in County Clare, Ireland, named Noreen. She hasn't left her village in 40 years. Her son has sent money from America, and she saved enough to join him at last. She wears 2 skirts, one on top of the other, because she doesn't want to pack an extra bag. She's never been on a train, and now she's about to cross the ocean. When the ticket arrives, she holds it like a newborn. She doesn't sleep the night before departure, not out of fear, but out of awe. Then there were the siblings, the runaway apprentices, the shy bride-to-be with a ring hidden in her corset. Each one different, each one holding the same slip of hope. Tickets came with instructions: what to bring, how to behave at customs, which boat to board at which hour. They were often printed in multiple languages, crammed together in tight fonts. Many passengers couldn't read them, so they relied on others, cousins, local priests, ship agents, to interpret. There were mistakes, wrong dates, misread ports. Confusion was common, but the desire to board was stronger than any barrier. And then came the day itself. You arrived at the docks, ticket in hand, trunk on shoulder. You followed signs, crowds, accents from a dozen nations. Maybe you passed first-class passengers being ushered onto the promenade with a flourish. You didn't envy them, not really. You had your own world waiting below decks. One that smelled like fresh bread and boiled potatoes. One that pulsed with human voices, laughter, and possibility. There was a medical inspection, a brief check to see if you were fit to sail. Eyes examined, teeth checked, questions asked, sometimes kindly, sometimes not. If you passed, and most did, you moved forward, past railings and ropes, toward a gangway that rose into the side of a giant floating city. And there it was, the Titanic. It loomed like a mountain above you, painted black, trimmed in white and red, with smokestacks taller than your hometown church. It looked impossible, magical. You might have crossed yourself, or whispered a quiet prayer in a language that the sea did not know. Then, the ticket was taken from your hand, and for the first time in your life, you stepped onto something that would not stay still. That moment, the slip of paper exchanged for a foot on a steel deck, was the first step of 1,000 new lives. Not all would be completed, but all began the same way. The moment the sole of your shoe meets the steel of the gangway, something subtle shifts in your chest. You are no longer on land. You are aboard a ship, and not just any ship. The Titanic, the great floating cathedral of the White Star Line. Her name seems to hum through the very air, as though the iron itself remembers being called legendary even before she sailed. But if you're stepping aboard as a third-class passenger, there's no fanfare. No brass band, no uniformed attendant tipping his hat. Your entrance is quieter, simpler, and somehow more human. A steward checks your name off a manifest. He doesn't look up. You move forward with your belongings, sometimes a single case, sometimes a bundle tied with rope, and you pass beneath the awning and into the belly of the ship. It is dimmer here. The sunlight doesn't reach far. The scent of salt air still clings to your coat, but now it's mingling with the smell of oil, coal smoke, wet rope, and something yeasty and warm that suggests someone, somewhere below, is baking bread. The passage narrows. Metal walls, pipes running above your head. A few flickering bulbs, shielded in brass cages, offer a glow not unlike candlelight. It is not luxurious, but it is solid, secure. The floor beneath your feet doesn't wobble, not yet. The ship is still in port, docked and anchored, though already alive with murmurs and creaks. Other passengers are boarding with you. You hear a child crying in Italian, the mother gently humming a lullaby. Behind you, someone mutters in Norwegian, trying to remember which deck they're assigned to. A small group of single Irishmen, fresh-faced, ruddy-cheeked, carry their boots in, their hands to keep them clean. A steward guides you downward, down a narrow stairwell, your trunk bumping against each step. The walls are painted a dull cream, chipped here and there. At every landing you catch glimpses of other passengers settling in, of linen being laid on bunks, of suitcases being shoved beneath beds. The air is growing warmer. Finally, you reach your section. This is E-Deck, one of the third-class levels. Your cabin is at the end of a hallway, beside a bulkhead that hums faintly with the ship's machinery. Inside, there are 4 bunks. One already has a girl sitting cross-legged, unpacking a scarf and a framed photograph. She glances up and smiles shyly. She's Polish, you think, though she hasn't yet spoken. You place your belongings on the floor. The mattress is thin but not hard. The sheets are stiff with starch. You press your hand against the cool metal wall beside your bed, and for a moment, you wonder, will you feel the sea through it? Above you, a low ceiling. To the left, a small sink, 1 towel, 1 mirror, 2 hooks, 4 dreams. The room smells faintly of soap and iron. Somewhere in the corridor, someone is singing. It echoes softly, melancholy, lovely, wordless. Maybe they are nervous. Maybe they always sing when they're happy. There are no portholes down here. That's reserved for higher decks. But there is a sense of movement, not physical, yet just emotional. You know you are on the cusp of something. The ship has not yet pulled away from the dock, but already the land behind you feels further away. You decide to explore, just a little. Back in the hallway, you follow the flow of other steerage passengers. A boy runs past you, laughing, pursued by an older sister. They turn a corner where the corridor widens into a common area, rows of benches bolted to the floor, a water basin, and a notice board. Posted there, the daily meal schedule, 3 times a day, hot food served in the dining saloon. A small miracle. You touch the paper, half expecting it to vanish like a dream. Across from you, a group of men are talking. Their accents are heavy. One gestures upward, mimicking the motion of a great staircase. You hear the word first class, said with amusement, not envy. Someone makes a joke and the group laughs. The ship feels like a city, you think. A city afloat, and cities have neighborhoods. Steerage has its own rhythm, its own pulse. It is louder, yes, less polished. But there is warmth here. Eyes meet and hold just a little longer. People nod. People help one another with bags. A woman you've never met offers you a hard-boiled egg. You decline, but thank her. Eventually, a bell rings 3 times. A low, resonant tone. It means departure is soon. The ship will cast off. Back in your cabin, your bunkmates have all arrived. An elderly German couple, a Welsh girl of no more than 16, traveling alone. You exchange names or something like them. No one shares a language, but you all smile. The ship shudders once. Then, a long, groaning call from the horn, deep and slow. It seems to vibrate through your bones. It has begun. Outside, the ocean waits. You can't see it, but you can feel it. The sway, the shift, the breathing of something larger than land. You lie on your bunk for a moment. The mattress dips just slightly under your weight. You listen to the rhythm of footsteps above, the occasional clang of machinery, the creak of walls expanding as the ship moves. You realize this is your new home for now. A steward passes outside, calling out instructions for supper. It will be served in the dining saloon shortly. You sit up, straighten your collar, and smooth your skirt or jacket. And then, with a quiet confidence born not of certainty but of hope, you step once more into the corridor and follow the crowd. The ship sails onward. And so do you. Your cabin smells faintly of coal dust, damp wool, and a kind of institutional soap. Clean, but not exactly comforting. Still, after a long journey to reach the ship and a first few hours of cautious exploration, there is something almost sacred about stepping into this little room and knowing this is yours. Your bunk. Your corner of the Titanic. The cabin door closes with a wooden click behind you. No lock, just a simple latch. The walls are pale, painted a neutral cream that feels vaguely medical. Overhead, the ceiling is low enough that even an average height man would be cautious stretching too far. A single light bulb hums inside a brass cage. The light is steady but dim. It casts soft shadows that sway slightly, like the breath of the ocean rocking behind the walls. There are 2 sets of bunk beds, one stacked above the other. Metal frames with thin wire mesh supporting stiff mattresses stuffed with straw or horsehair. The beds are narrow, but you fit. A white pillow rests at the head, surprisingly plump. A blanket, gray rough wool, has been folded at the foot. Your bunkmate, if you have one, has not yet arrived. You take the lower bunk. Fewer ladders to climb in the night. There is a sink in the corner with a small mirror above it, warped at the edges, its silver backing bubbling just slightly in one spot. But it reflects your face well enough. Perhaps too well. The mirror doesn't flatter. It tells the truth. Travel-worn eyes, a few creases from tension or excitement, hair that wants brushing. But there is also something new in your expression, a quiet bravery. You nod to your reflection. On a nearby hook, someone has already hung a coat, not yours. You peek out into the hallway, then quickly back in. The other occupant must be exploring. For now, the space is yours alone. You sit on the edge of the bed. The mattress crunches slightly beneath you. It's not soft, not like a feather bed back home, but it's clean. And it doesn't smell like mildew or mold. You press a hand against the sheet. Crisp. Fresh. It's strange to feel grateful for something so basic. But when you've shared, sleeping quarters with chickens or worked on floors of stone, even a thin mattress feels luxurious. You lie back for a moment, staring at the ceiling. There's a pipe that runs just above your head. Steam hisses through it periodically, warm and whispering. It's oddly comforting, like a sleeping animal nearby. The room is narrow, just wide enough to stretch out your arms barely. But for third class, it's considered generous. And best of all, it is yours, without needing to share it with dozens of others the way steerage passengers once had to on older liners. Titanic was meant to feel modern even for the poorest on board. A tap at the door. You sit up as it opens. A young man enters, freckled, maybe 21 at most, with a mop of dark curly hair and a shy smile. "Sorry," he says in a soft Scottish accent. "Didn't mean to wake ye." You assure him you weren't sleeping. He nods and tosses a knapsack onto the top bunk. You learn his name is Callum. He's from Dundee, heading to Boston to work, in a factory his cousin manages. His voice is low, gentle. You find yourself relaxing already. Later, more cabin mates arrive. In cabins meant for four, it's not uncommon to see a blend of nationalities, languages, and ages. One older man with white hair and a thick mustache says very little, but offers each of you a piece of dried apple from a cloth bundle. He sleeps sitting up, back straight, legs crossed like a monk. You never learn his name. The other is a boy, no, more than 15, traveling alone. He fidgets with his boots, tying and retying the laces. He stutters when spoken to, but smiles when no one is looking. There's no curtain for privacy, no personal drawers, just hooks, small luggage under beds, and shared space. But somehow, this forced closeness begins to feel safe, like a temporary family. Evening comes and the ship has begun to sway gently. Not enough to make you seasick, but enough to make the walls feel slightly alive. Pipes groan. Somewhere down the hall, someone is playing a fiddle. Poorly, but with enthusiasm. Laughter drifts through the air like dust motes in sunlight. You sit on your bunk with a borrowed cup of tea, lukewarm and slightly bitter. But it warms your hands. Cabin conversations begin. Not everyone speaks the same language, but humanity has ways of bridging gaps. Gestures, nods, shared stories told in broken English or native tongues that carry their own rhythm. Callum tells a story about a cow that got loose in the train station at Aberdeen. The old man chuckles. The boy finally laughs aloud. There's no clock, but the day has grown long. One by one, shoes are taken off, blankets drawn up, conversations turn to whispers, then silence. The Titanic rocks ever so slightly, a cradle made of iron. You lie in your bunk, arms across your chest, and listen to the symphony of sleep around you. Soft snores, rustling wool, the endless thrum of engines turning somewhere deep in the ship's heart. And then, nothing. Not sleep, not yet, but a kind of in-between. You close your eyes and imagine what lies ahead. Cities, jobs, meals you can't name yet. Or maybe you just see the moon through steel. Maybe you dream of bread. Either way, you're home. For now. Morning in Steerage did not come with the sunrise. There were no windows in most third-class cabins, no view of the sky shifting from black to blue, no seagulls to announce the day. Instead, morning arrived with sound. A particular rhythm of life below decks, subtle yet undeniable. It began with footsteps, soft-soled shoes tapping against metal floors, some quick, some careful. The footsteps of stewards starting their rounds, of early risers heading for the washroom, of mothers calming, fussing infants. These steps echoed gently like the ship's own heartbeat, filtered through long corridors and steel walls. Next came the sounds of waking voices, first whispers, then greetings, then muffled laughter. The low clink of a wash basin being used. The slap of water in a porcelain bowl. The creak of bunk beds as sleepy bodies stirred beneath rough wool blankets. There was no official wake-up call, no bell. Yet somehow everyone began to rise around the same time, as if the ship itself whispered, "It's morning now. Time to begin again." You awoke to the scent of shipboard life. Warm metal, clean soap, the faint trace of coal drifting down from the funnels above, and if the air vents were kind, a teasing wisp of bread baking somewhere far away in the kitchens. Your back ached just slightly from the stiff mattress, but it was a good ache. An ache that reminded you, you had a bed, you had a bunk, you were on your way. Your cabin mate stirred too. Callum rubbed his eyes and muttered something in Gaelic before swinging down from the top bunk with surprising agility. The boy in the corner, now awake, stared for a long time at the ceiling before sitting up slowly, as if rising from a dream. The old man was already gone, his bed neatly made, the blanket tucked with military precision. No one heard him leave. You splashed water on your face at the sink. It was cold enough to sting, but refreshing. There was one towel for 4 people, but everyone had brought their own cloth or scarf. The mirror was fogged with breath and warm air, but someone wiped it clean with a sleeve. Dressing was simple. You wore the same clothes as the day before. Maybe you brushed them off. Maybe you retied your laces. For many, this was the best outfit they owned. A wool skirt or heavy trousers, a shirt that had once been white, a vest passed down through 2 generations. Everything practical, everything with purpose. In the corridor, life was already unfolding. Children played with bits of string or rolled marbles against the wall. 2 sisters whispered in Italian, their hands moving faster than their words. A man sang softly to himself while adjusting his suspenders, something that might have been a lullaby or a hymn. The hallways, narrow the night before, now felt full. Not crowded exactly, but alive. This wasn't just sleeping quarters. This was a neighborhood afloat. You passed others you recognized from the boarding line. A woman with a yellow shawl, a boy with a patch on one knee. You nodded. Maybe you smiled. Friendships formed quickly on a ship like this. People noticed kindness. They remembered a shared blanket, a translated word, a biscuit split in silence. Soon you found your way toward the shared washrooms. They were small but well-maintained, with running water, something astonishing to many third-class passengers who came from towns where even the local church didn't have plumbing. You took turns. No one lingered. There was modesty and efficiency, a rhythm already developing. By now, the scent of breakfast began to travel. It crept through the halls like a gentle fog. Warm bread, porridge, tea, a hint of salt pork maybe, or something savory. It was hard to tell. The kitchen was far above, but the ship's vents, its very structure, carried aromas like whispers. You followed the scent, not just with your nose, but with your feet, your ears, your instincts. Everyone did. The dining saloon called. It was located at the stern end of the ship on F deck, down another narrow stairwell, past crates, doors, and crew. The saloon was long, plain, filled with rows of wooden benches and bolted tables. No white, linens here, no fine china, but it was clean, bright even, painted a pale green with white pillars and polished floors. And it had windows, tiny portholes, spaced along the hull. From here, you could see the sea, just slivers of blue-gray water and sky, enough to remind you that you were moving, that you were no longer on land, that the world was wide and you were crossing it. You took your place at the table. There were no assigned seats, but people tended to sit in the same places each day. You sat beside Callum. Across from you, a mother with twin boys. One of them held a tin whistle. The other clutched a biscuit like treasure. The stewards came then, young men in white jackets and flat caps. Efficient, but not unkind. They brought tin teapots, enamel mugs, slices of bread, bowls of porridge. No ceremony, but no rush either. Everything had its rhythm. You bowed your head for a moment, a habit perhaps. A quiet thank you, if not to a god, then to the hands who'd kneaded the dough and boiled the oats. And then, with a deep breath and a slow spoonful, the day truly began. It wasn't just breakfast. It was hope, made tangible. It was warmth in your mouth, strength in your belly, and the first moment of comfort you'd felt since leaving home. And, in that moment, surrounded by strangers who already felt like neighbors beneath steel ceilings and portholes to the Atlantic, you felt something rare. You belonged. If you were to close your eyes during breakfast in third class on the Titanic, you might hear more than you saw. The scrape of spoons against tin bowls, the hollow thump of a bread crust being tapped thoughtfully against a table, murmured conversations, some in English, some not at all. The occasional laugh, muffled under the low ceiling like a secret trying to escape. This was breakfast in the belly of the ship. The dining saloon for third-class passengers was no palace. It had none of the grandeur of the upper decks, no chandeliers, no velvet chairs, no string quartets playing in the corner. But it was bright in its own way. Painted pale green with white overhead beams, it was functional, and more importantly, filled with light from electric bulbs that buzzed gently above each row of tables. There were long wooden benches bolted firmly to the floor and matching tables to prevent tipping during rougher seas. The benches were smooth with wear, as though thousands of meals had been shared here already, even though Titanic had only been at sea for a day or two. The very shape of the room invited community. No walls, no corners to hide in. Everyone ate together, and oh, what a breakfast it was. For many steerage passengers, it was the most bountiful meal they'd had in recent memory. On that fateful April voyage, third-class breakfast offerings were simple but generous. Oatmeal or porridge, freshly baked bread or ship's biscuits, marmalade, tea, and sometimes slices of ham or cold meat. Occasionally, an egg or a bit of cheese would appear, depending on the kitchen stores and the day of the week. Porridge arrived in deep bowls, still steaming. It was thick and hearty, often made with water rather than milk, but served hot, and sweetened with a little molasses or brown sugar if the cook was feeling kind. For those from rural Ireland or the Scottish Highlands, this porridge was comfort food, evoking memories of cold mornings at home. The bread was crusty on the outside, warm and soft within. It had been baked fresh in Titanic's enormous kitchens, where dozens of bakers worked around the clock to feed more than 2,000 passengers. The bread arrived by the loaf, and each table would tear pieces off with their hands. No butter knives here, just eager fingers and small cloth napkins. Marmalade came in shared jars, the orange peel glistening like little windows into sunlight. It was a treat, especially for children. Many had never tasted it before. One could watch as a young boy dipped his finger in with reverent curiosity before daring to spread it on his bread. His eyes widened at the burst of citrus. Tea was poured from tall tin kettles carried in by stewards. The tea was strong, dark, and usually sweetened. Milk was a luxury and rarely provided in steerage unless for children or the ill. But the warmth was what mattered. That first sip, hot, slightly bitter, earthy, woke the senses and grounded you in the here and now. Callum, your bunkmate, had a habit of stirring his tea with a crust of bread. He claimed it softened the crust and flavored the tea. Whether this was true or not, it had the odd effect of making him look scholarly, as if performing a gentle scientific experiment. Across the table, a German woman carefully poured tea for her husband, steady even in the ship's gentle sway. They spoke very little, but their silence was companionable, almost reverent. And beside you, an elderly man said grace before every bite, not aloud, but with closed eyes and a whispered thought. Perhaps he was giving thanks, or perhaps he was remembering. Conversation around the tables bloomed slowly. No one rushed the meal. Third-class passengers weren't expected to dine quickly and leave. There were no other waves of guests waiting their turn. The saloon belonged to them alone, and though the food was not endless, the welcome was, in its own quiet way, enduring. Conversations floated between tables, sometimes bridging languages. A nod here, a shared smile there. Someone would offer an extra slice of bread. Another would explain what marmalade was in 3 different dialects. A young woman from Finland attempted to pronounce toast, failing adorably and causing a ripple of laughter that felt warmer than the tea. There were little rituals. Some passengers had brought their own mugs or utensils, unwilling to trust the ship's supplies. Others had tucked prayer cards beneath their plates. Children tapped on the table when they were done, a custom from back home that meant, "Thank you." And all the while, above this scene of communal breaking of bread, the ship continued its silent voyage. No waves were visible from here, deep in the vessel's belly, but one could feel them. Small tilts, slight shifts, a rhythm in the stomach that was less motion and more presence. The ocean was near. You could taste it in the salt on the ham, smell it faintly in the air ducts, hear it in the soft rumble that hummed through the table legs. Some passengers, new to sailing, found eating while moving strange. One Irish boy claimed he could feel the porridge slosh in his belly as the ship swayed. His brother insisted the ship wasn't moving at all. It was just the sea trying to follow them. They laughed, mouths full of bread, and then breakfast ended not with a bell, but with a soft shift. The stewards began clearing plates. Someone yawned. Another stood and stretched. A few lingered over the last sip of tea, unwilling to leave just yet. You stood slowly, your belly full, your hands warm, and your heart, well, your heart was quiet. Not joyful exactly, but soothed. Back in the corridor, the air felt cooler, but the warmth of breakfast clung to you like an invisible shawl. You had eaten well. You had shared a meal with strangers who, in that one small hour, had become part of your journey. And you knew that tomorrow morning you'd return to the same bench, the same bowl, the same soft soundscape of waking voices. But for now, the day stretched ahead, and the ship sailed on. To understand life in third class aboard the Titanic, you must begin with its most beloved room, the dining saloon. Tucked away on F deck, near the very back of the ship, the third-class dining saloon wasn't exactly hidden, but it certainly wasn't advertised in the same glossy brochures that boasted of first-class ballrooms and a la carte cafes. And yet for over 700 steerage passengers, this room was the beating heart of their days. A place not only of food, but of fellowship, of warmth, of routine. Let us walk there together. You descend a narrow metal staircase, the railings smooth beneath your hand. The air grows warmer as you near the dining saloon, laced with scents of bread and something faintly peppery. The hallway opens up, and you step into a long, wide chamber that seems at first glance surprisingly spacious. The third-class dining saloon stretches almost the full width of the ship, a rectangular expanse with rows upon rows of wooden tables and benches, each set bolted firmly to the floor. This is no accident. On ships of this size, even the smallest rocking can cause furniture to slide, and though the Titanic is famously stable, safety and simplicity take precedence here. The first thing you notice is the color. The walls are painted, a soft green. Not pastel, not seafoam, but something gentle and utilitarian like faded meadow grass. Above, the beams are white, clean, and sturdy. Brass light fixtures dangle from the ceiling at regular intervals, each enclosed in protective cages. The light they cast is yellowish, a little dim, but steady. It creates an ambiance that is neither harsh nor romantic, just practical, with a hint of coziness. There are no windows. Only portholes, small and round, spaced widely apart. You can't see much through them, mostly glimmers of moving gray. But every now and then, a flicker of seafoam appears, reminding you that this room, so solid and still, is floating on, something vast and unknowable. You run your fingers along one of the tables. The surface is smooth from years of use, though Titanic is new. These benches, these fixtures, are modeled on years of experience aboard other ships. There are no tablecloths, no centerpieces. The simplicity is reassuring. Each place is set with tin or enamel plates, sturdy cutlery, and, if you're lucky, a mug waiting to be filled with tea. At mealtimes, this room fills with motion and sound. But now, in the quiet hour between breakfast and lunch, it rests, empty but not lifeless. You can almost hear the echoes of earlier laughter, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of families eating together for perhaps the first time in days. There is no music here, not formally. But sometimes someone hums. A boy with a whistle plays, a few crooked notes. Once a steward from Belfast brought in a harmonica and played a waltz while clearing dishes. The saloon isn't silent, even when still. It remembers sound. Each table sits 6 to 8 people. There's no assigned seating. And yet, patterns emerge. Families cluster naturally. Friends from the same village tend to stick together. But occasionally, by accident or design, strangers sit side by side. And that is where stories begin. In the far corner of the room, near the galley entrance, there is a swinging door through which stewards appear like clockwork balancing trays of food. Their uniforms are crisp, though not formal. They work quickly, quietly, and seem to know exactly how much to bring and where. There is no menu to order from in third class. Meals are fixed, planned days in advance and portioned with care. But the saloon feels generous nonetheless. There is always enough bread, always enough porridge, and while not lavish, the food is warm and, most importantly, shared. On one wall, a notice board displays the day's meals, written in English with simple descriptions: breakfast, porridge, bread, marmalade, tea, lunch, pea soup, salted pork, boiled potatoes. Supper, cabin biscuits, cheese, tea. It's not gourmet, but it's consistent. It's dependable. And that in itself feels luxurious when you've spent years never knowing what the next meal might be. Back in the center of the room, a steward is polishing one of the light fixtures. He whistles as he works, occasionally muttering to himself in a northern accent too thick to place. You nod to him. He nods back. You ask what the saloon is like at dinner time. Like a church on Christmas Eve, he says with a grin. Everyone shows up, everyone eats, and everyone's in a better mood after. Then he adds, except we don't sing hymns. We just ask for seconds. You walk slowly down the center aisle of the room, imagining it full. Clinking spoons, children shouting for more jam, an old man nodding off with tea in hand, 2 teenagers blushing over shared bread. Each bench holds a story, each plate, a memory, and, though this space is tucked away, painted modestly and lit without flair, it is beloved. Not because of its architecture, not even because of the food, but because here, far from home, across language and custom, people gather 3 times a day to remember what it means to be cared for, to be full, to be together. You run your hand along the bench one last time, and you think, this room will not be in the history books. No photographs will show it in lavish detail. No museum will recreate it with velvet ropes and plaques. But for hundreds of souls crossing the Atlantic in April 1912, this dining saloon was a sanctuary, a simple, green-painted room below the ocean line. There's something universally reassuring about routine, especially when you are far from home, floating somewhere between past and future, between countries and identities. On the RMS Titanic, third-class passengers quickly learned to treasure the quiet rituals of each day, none more sacred than the ringing of the dining bell. It wasn't a grand sound, not a dramatic gong or a clanging chime, just a simple bell, rung by a steward's steady hand at the far end of the corridor. But it carried. It echoed gently through the metal halls and narrow staircases of steerage like a whispered invitation. Come, it's time to eat. The bell rang 3 times a day, not on the hour, but in harmony with the kitchen's readiness. Stewards had no need for clocks here. Their rhythm was born of practice. You'd hear the first ring during the quiet lull after morning activity, the second just as the hunger of mid-afternoon began to stir, and the third as the sun, invisible from below decks, began its long descent into ocean twilight. When the bell rang, people responded. It was never chaos, no mad rush, just a slow rising, a shuffle of feet, the clatter of boots hitting the floor, the rustling of skirts and shawls. Children perked up instantly, dropping marbles and chalk to scamper after the scent of food. Adults moved more slowly, but with purpose. Some brought with them tiny trinkets, a spoon from home, a good luck coin, a scrap of cloth tied around a wrist. Others brought silence, worn like an invisible coat. But all brought their appetite, and something else, something intangible, expectation. Because food was more than fuel, especially here in steerage among people whose stomachs had often known scarcity. A hot meal served by someone else, a stranger in a white apron who didn't ask your name but still brought your soup, was a kind of dignity. You took your place at the bench. The stewards, though few in number, moved with practiced grace. One young man, barely 20, had a way of balancing 3 bowls on each arm. He made jokes with the children and greeted the elderly with a subtle nod of respect. Another steward, a quiet fellow with a mustache like a railway porter, never spoke during service but always brought extra bread to the table with the most children. There were unspoken rules during these meals. The bread was passed clockwise. The eldest at the table got the first pour of tea. If you spilled something, you apologized with a hand over your heart, regardless of language. If you saw someone hesitate before taking a portion, you offered yours. It was etiquette born not of instruction but of empathy. Some passengers said grace before eating. Others simply bowed their heads for a moment. You'd see crosses traced on foreheads, silent prayers mouthed in Russian, eyes closed over folded hands. And sometimes, the silence itself was the prayer. As the meal began, the room shifted, from stillness to life. Spoons moved in unison. Bites were taken with that first cautious hope. Conversation, slow at first, picked up like a wave rolling across the saloon. You'd hear soft laughter, gentle teasing, even the occasional hiccup from someone who'd eaten too fast. One evening, Callum, your bunkmate, dropped his biscuit into his tea. He looked around sheepishly before fishing it out with 2 fingers. A young woman from Galway giggled, then did the same with her own. Within minutes, half the table was dipping biscuits, and someone started calling it third-class dessert. These little moments, meals became more than meals. They became stories in the making. You began to notice patterns. The Swedish family always sat 2 tables over near the wall. The Italian brothers preferred the table closest to the galley, where they could smell the food first. The Welsh miners clustered near the rear, trading stories in half-whispers over thick mugs of tea, and there was the old Hungarian couple who brought their own pickled vegetables to every meal. They'd unwrap them from a cloth napkin and offer a piece to anyone within reach. No one ever refused, though the taste was an acquired one. As the meal progressed, time itself softened. People lingered. No one had urgent appointments. No one was expected to be anywhere else. So they stayed, talking, singing occasionally. Once, a small boy stood up on the bench and recited a rhyme about cows that made the entire row burst into applause. Cleanup was as quiet as the meal had been. Plates stacked, crumbs brushed away with the side of a palm, leftover bread wrapped carefully in cloth for later. No waste here. Every crust had value. As the last stewards made their rounds, collecting tin mugs and wiping down tables, the bell was rung again. Not loud, just once, a signal that the saloon was closing for now. People rose slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth, the comfort of shared experience. They folded their napkins. They offered polite nods to those beside them, no names exchanged, but something deeper. Recognition. A silent thank you. And then, they stepped out once more into the corridors of steel and steam. But something lingered. The ritual had grounded them, fed them, held them briefly in the embrace of normalcy. In a world moving rapidly forward, toward new countries, unknown futures, and unspoken fears, the dining bell was a kind of lighthouse, calling them to pause, to eat, to remember that even in transit, even below deck, they were human. And so 3 times a day the bell would ring, and 3 times a day the people of Steerage would come. Lunch in Steerage was not just a meal, it was an event. By midday, the Titanic's great engines had been humming for hours, the ship cutting smoothly through the Atlantic. You couldn't hear the waves from F-deck, but you could feel them, gentle, swells that made the floor rise and fall like a breath. Around you, the rhythm of third class carried on. Children ran the length of the corridor. Mothers hushed babies with soft songs. And somewhere, someone practiced the concertina with surprising goes. Then came the dining bell. Its sound familiar now, a kind of friend. This time it came with a richer scent. Not the warm grain of breakfast, but something more robust, something savory. The queue to the dining saloon moved more quickly now. Bellies were emptier. Steps had more purpose. You walked with the others, guided as much by instinct as by smell, and by the time you reached the saloon doors, the air was thick with it. Pea soup and Irish stew, 2 dishes. 1 ladle at a time. Let's begin with the soup. It arrived in wide bowls, not elegant but deep enough to cradle steam. The color was greenish-yellow, thick and speckled with soft bits of carrot or potato. It smelled of dried herbs, parsley, perhaps thyme, and had the unmistakable warmth of something long simmered. It was not delicate. This was food meant to satisfy. Some passengers stirred it slowly, watching the broth roll in gentle circles before taking a bite. Others dove in quickly, eager and unbothered by the heat. Children blew on their spoons, puffing small clouds of steam into the air like miniature locomotives. The flavor was earthy, not rich, but comforting, salted just enough to lift the sweetness of the peas. Occasionally there was a small shred of ham. Someone at your table whispered that a real cook had made it, that the kitchen steward used to work in a hotel in Liverpool. Whether true or not, everyone nodded approvingly. Next came the Irish stew. It was ladled into shallow bowls, thicker, heavier, and heartier than the soup. Made from mutton, potatoes, onions, and turnips, it had the kind of smell that made your mouth water before you even sat down. The meat was soft, cooked until it gave way to the spoon. The vegetables had turned silky, melting slightly into the gravy. And there was pepper, just enough to leave a warm tingle at the back of your throat. At your table, Callum took 1 bite and closed his eyes in exaggerated pleasure. That, he said solemnly, could make a man fall in love. Across from you, an older Irish woman chuckled. It'd take more than stew, she muttered, but it's a fine start. Laughter bubbled up across the table. Not loud, not raucous, just the shared joy of good food and good company. One girl, no more than 10, tried her first spoonful and promptly declared it better than Da's wedding dinner. Her mother looked scandalized but couldn't hide her smile. The bread, as always, was plentiful, sliced thick, coarse, and slightly nutty. Perfect for dipping. The stew clung to it like it belonged. Some passengers had brought little chunks of cheese or butter from home, wrapped in cloth or wax paper. They shared, quietly, passing it along the bench with shy smiles. There were stories, too. Meals had a way of inviting memory. As hands moved from bowl to bread to mug, mouths opened not just to eat, but to speak. A Swedish farmer told of making pea soup over an open fire during a snowstorm. A woman from Cork recounted how her mother's stew always had barley, and how she missed that particular chew. One man, gently slurring from a bit too much strong tea, insisted that no stew was complete without a splash of Guinness. He raised his mug in mock salute. The tea, as usual, was hot and a little bitter. but no one complained. It warmed the bones, steadied the stomach, and gave the meal its finishing note. Some sipped slowly. Others drank in large gulps as though trying to catch up with the day. After the main meal, there was a surprise. Cabin biscuits, dry, dense, and slightly sweet, they were served with a thin smear of plum jam. Not every table received them. Perhaps a steward was feeling generous, perhaps there were leftovers. Either way, the room brightened. A treat, however small, changed the tone entirely. You bit into yours carefully. It crumbled with a satisfying crunch, then softened on the tongue. The jam was tart, clinging to the roof of your mouth like a stubborn thought. Delicious. The boy beside you licked his fingers, then immediately looked guilty. His mother handed him a rag with a patient smile. The room, for that brief window, felt almost festive. Not loud, not crowded, just full of flavor, of people, of something close to peace. By the end of lunch, bowls were scraped clean, bread baskets emptied, tea mugs drained. The stewards moved quietly, collecting dishes, nodding. Politely, one offered a wink to a girl who looked bored. She giggled, hiding behind her older sister. You rose slowly, full in every way. Your legs moved sluggishly, not from fatigue, but from contentment. The kind of stillness that comes only after a good meal, shared with others who've traveled far and still have farther to go. As you stepped back into the corridor, the sounds of the dining saloon faded, but the taste lingered. The warmth too. And in that moment, you realize something simple, something profound. Stew and soup may not be remembered in history books, but for the hundreds of steerage passengers aboard the Titanic, they were more than meals. They were kindness, served warm. There's something peculiar about the way people bond over meals. Not with speeches or handshakes, not with grand gestures or proclamations, but with the passing of a loaf of bread, the sharing of a laugh, the quiet clink of cutlery against enamel plates. On the Titanic, in the third-class dining saloon, this happened 3 times a day. People who'd never have met on land found themselves elbow to elbow, trading stories, glances, and sometimes secrets, between spoonfuls of soup and sips of lukewarm tea. On your second evening aboard, you found yourself seated between 2 such passengers. To your right sat Mrs. Nora Quinn, a widow from County Kerry, Ireland. In her mid-40s, with silver just beginning to thread through her dark hair, she had the weathered hands of someone who'd worked land and laundry, and the posture of someone who still carried too many worries in her spine. To your left, a tall man with a sun-darkened face and slow movements, a Swede named Henrik Olsson, traveling alone with a suitcase full of seeds and a coat 2 sizes too large. It was Nora who spoke first. "You eat like a priest," she said, her voice dry, but not unkind. Quiet and thoughtful. "Is it penance or habit?" You blinked mid-chew, then smiled. "Mostly habit." She offered a half-smile in return, then tore her bread and dipped it into her stew. "It's a good one tonight. Reminds me of when my husband used to cook. He only made one thing, but he made it well. One stew once a week, and the rest of the time he let me handle the kitchen." She paused, glanced sideways. He wasn't a bad man, just not a hungry one. Henrik chuckled softly, his voice as slow and thick as tree sap. "In Sweden, we stew everything. Meat, potatoes, sometimes fish. When I was a boy, we stewed apples, once. My mother said it was to celebrate the end of winter. It still tasted like winter." His accent made every sentence feel like it had wandered through a pine forest before arriving at your table. Nora raised an eyebrow. "Apples and stew? That sounds like a sin against both." Henrik shrugged. We were hungry. The conversation, like the stew, warmed over time. There was no rush, no need to impress. Just the slow, steady unfolding of human company. Nora told you about her 4 children, 2 of whom were already in Boston. She carried a small tin in her bag, she said, with letters folded and reread so many times the creases had worn holes. She was joining her eldest daughter, who worked as a maid for a family who, as she put it, had more silver than sense. She'd sold her last pig to buy the ticket. The farm was left to a cousin. There wasn't much left to stay for, she said, except ghosts and rain. Henrik, on the other hand, spoke little of family, just his plans. He had heard that in Minnesota the land was flat and the winters were honest. He had seeds from his father's farm, cabbage, rye, beets. "I don't want to get rich," he said plainly. "I want to plant something that lives." Nora looked at him then, not romantically, not curiously, but with that quiet recognition one soul gives another when it sees weariness and resolve living side by side. "I'd plant chickens if I could," she said with a smirk. "Harder to smuggle in your pockets." They laughed together, and so did you. You ate in rhythm after that. Not synchronized exactly, but gently attuned. Henrik passed you the bread before you asked. Nora poured tea for all three of you without comment. You dabbed your napkin across your chin and offered Henrik the jam when he hesitated. The three of you, strangers still, formed a table-sized universe, an alliance made of crumbs and conversation. Later, as the meal wound down and stewards began their careful cleanup, Nora leaned back slightly, her hands wrapped around her mug. "I once heard," she began slowly, "that ships carry not just passengers but their wishes. The heavier the wish, the deeper it rides in the hull." Henrik tilted his head. "Then this one must be very deep." She nodded. It carries a widow's hope, a farmer's field, and probably 100 more." You looked around the saloon, at the tired young mother singing to a drowsy baby, at the boy whispering to a toy soldier in his coat pocket, at the man practicing English phrases under his breath. Wishes everywhere. Heavy and fragile, sailing across the Atlantic with nothing but steel and steam to carry them. The meal ended, not with applause but with the simple clatter of mugs and the soft scrape of benches. Nora stood brushing crumbs from her lap. "Same table tomorrow?" she asked, as though it was already understood. Henrik nodded. "Unless you found better company." "Not likely," she said, and offered a wink. You stood as well, feeling full not just in your stomach, but in your chest. Something had been shared here, something that would not make headlines or entries in history books, but mattered nonetheless. You returned to your bunk that night with the scent of stew still in your hair and the echo of Nora's laughter still in your ears. And somewhere down the hall in another cabin or corner of the ship, two people you barely knew were falling asleep knowing that tomorrow at lunch there would be bread and tea and company. Sometimes that is enough. If you ever found yourself lost below decks on the Titanic, wandering the narrow halls of third class unsure of left from right, you could find your way again by following the sound of laughter. Not the polite kind whispered behind gloves. Not the forced chuckles of formal dinners or ballroom pleasantries. No, this was true laughter, from the belly, from the soul, and more often than not, it came from the children of Steerage. There were over 100 children traveling in third class. Aboard the Titanic, some infants, some wide-eyed toddlers, and others teetering on the edge of adolescence, old enough to understand the importance of this voyage, but young enough to still believe in miracles. They came from all over, small villages in Ireland, crowded tenements in Poland, snowy farms in Finland, and bustling ports in Italy. But once aboard, nationality melted like sugar in tea. They became one tribe, bound not by language but by games, giggles, and an endless curiosity about everything. You saw them first at breakfast. A small boy, barely 4, sat beside his older sister, clutching a biscuit in both hands as though it were a sacred object. He nibbled at it with deep concentration, crumbs dotting his chin and collar. When the steward passed with the marmalade jar, he squealed, not in fear but delight, and pointed as if he'd just seen a treasure chest. At another table, twin girls shared a mug of tea, taking turns blowing on the surface to cool it. Each time one sipped, the other made a face pretending it was poison, only to laugh and try it herself. The dining saloon, usually a place of calm and communal murmurs, became brighter when the children were there. Their chatter, their games, their snack time songs, everything about them broke through the metal and steam of the ship's walls and made it feel, for a while, like home. Between meals, they roamed. There was no playroom for steerage children, No nannies or velvet prams like those seen in first class. But they had something better. Space. Not wide, not luxurious, but winding corridors, forgotten corners, empty stairwells, and the long stretch of the outer deck reserved for third-class fresh air. Here, imagination took over. A small cluster of children turned a crate into a ship of their own. They took turns being captain and cook, sailor and stowaway. One boy claimed he saw a whale through a porthole and was instantly crowned Ocean Watcher, a title he took very seriously. He carried a spoon in his belt like a sword. Rags became puppets. Buttons became treasure. Dusty corners became castles. Occasionally, a steward would scold them gently, never too harshly, for the stewards had been children once too. One even taught them a clapping game from Belfast, which they learned with the intensity of scholars studying ancient texts. Then there were the infants. Babies in shawls, babies in arms, babies wrapped tightly against their mothers with cloth that smelled of home. They didn't speak, of course, but their cries, their gurgles, their sudden squeals of joy, these were part of the music of steerage, woven between the shuffle of feet and clatter of cutlery. One baby, round-faced and perpetually surprised, became something of a mascot in your section of the ship. Her name was Anna, and her mother, Magda from Hungary, carried her everywhere in a woven sling. The baby had a single curl of hair on top of her head that pointed upward like a question mark. She smiled at everyone, and in doing so, became the silent anchor of many tired hearts. Meals were chaotic but delightful with the children around. They spilled more than they ate. They sang grace in mismatched syllables. They asked questions, so many questions about the stew, the bread, the tea, and why grown-ups never smiled while chewing. But they also shared. You saw one boy offer his crust to a girl with no bread left. You saw another carry a mug back to Mel, the steward, when his table-mate was too shy. A little girl with only one shoe gave her biscuit to a child crying softly into his sleeves, and always laughter, sometimes high and shrill, sometimes soft and breathless, but always real. It echoed down the halls and filled the cracks between strangers. After supper one evening, the children gathered in the corner of the saloon and staged a play. Unplanned, unrehearsed. They used bread rolls as props, a soup ladle as a microphone. One played the captain wearing a mop on his head like a hat. Another played the ocean itself, lying flat on the floor and waving her arms like waves. Their ship inevitably sank, but everyone survived, saved by a magical flying marmalade jar. The grown-ups clapped. Some laughed until they cried, because in that moment, beneath the weight of dreams and distance and unspeakable uncertainty, the children had given them a gift. Joy. Pure and small, like sugar spilled on a wooden table. You remember it now, perhaps, from your own youth. That sensation of being held not by hands, but by presence, of knowing that no matter where the ship sailed, there would be laughter after lunch. That in the belly of a steel giant, amidst engines and orders and endless gray water, there was a place where children played and the world for a moment felt soft. Not every story needs to swirl with drama. Some are quieter, simpler, like the clink of a mug against a table or the rising steam from a freshly poured cup of tea. In third class aboard the RMS Titanic, water and tea were more than just beverages. They were lifelines, daily rituals that grounded people far from home. They offered warmth, comfort, and just enough familiarity to remind passengers of where they came from and where they hoped to go. Let us begin with water. It is strange, perhaps, to imagine that something so essential could become something worth noticing. But in steerage, the presence of clean, safe water was no small thing. Many passengers came from places where drinking water had to be drawn from a well or carried in buckets or boiled to be safe. Some had spent weeks on trains and ferries before even reaching the Titanic, surviving on whatever they could carry. Cold tea in bottles, broth in jars, and yes, precious water poured carefully into tin cups. On the Titanic, third-class passengers had access to running water. Cold, certainly, but clean. There were shared sinks in the cabins and communal wash basins along the corridors. And while not all dared drink directly from the tap, most agreed it tasted better than the river back home. Each dining saloon meal included water on the tables, poured from large metal pitchers into enamel mugs. It was often the first thing you drank upon sitting, taken in slow sips to settle the stomach and wake the mouth. But the true star of third-class refreshment was tea, served 3 times daily. At breakfast, lunch, and supper, tea was a small miracle in a mug. It arrived dark and steaming, often strong enough to stand a spoon in. Poured from dented metal pots by brisk-handed stewards, it filled the air with the familiar scent of dry leaves, warm earth, and faint bitterness. There was no sugar on the tables in third class, at least not in bowls or sachets. But some stewards, if asked kindly or given a wink, might offer a spoonful or two from the kitchen stores. Milk was rare, saved for children and the ill. Most drank it black, or with a crust of bread dipped in for sweetness. For some passengers, this was nothing new. Irish and British travelers sipped their tea with the casual grace of habit. Others, from further east or northern climes, approached it more cautiously, uncertain whether to treat it as a meal or a medicine. Henrik Olsen, the Swedish farmer you'd shared stew with 2 nights ago, had never tasted tea before Titanic. He held the mug close to his nose for a long moment, then took a tiny sip and winced. "Bitter," he said. "You'll get used to it," said Nora Quinn, the Irish widow beside him, already halfway through her cup. "It's the flavor of patience." Later that week, Henrik was seen brewing his own concoction, a sort of herbal blend made from dried mint he'd tucked into his coat lining. He offered a sip to Nora, who wrinkled her nose. "Tastes like toothpaste." Henrik merely smiled. Better than bitterness. The mugs themselves were worth noting. Heavy, chipped, and never matching. Some were blue-speckled enamel, others plain tin. A few bore the faded logos of previous ships, relics from vessels long decommissioned. Passengers sometimes grew fond of a particular cup and would try to claim it each meal, slipping into the dining saloon early to find their mug waiting at the table. Children adored the ritual. Tea meant you were grown up. Even if the mug was mostly filled with warm water or thinned milk, being handed a cup felt like a kind of promotion. A little girl from Donegal insisted on holding her mug with 2 hands, pinky raised, mimicking the fancy ladies she imagined. Lived upstairs. The stewards didn't mind. They were used to spills, and besides, spilled tea smelled nice. Then there were the evening mugs. After supper, long after the last spoon scraped the bottom of a bowl, a few lucky passengers might receive a second round, not official, not part of the menu. But if you lingered, helped clear the table, or happened to smile at the right moment, a steward might reappear with a kettle still half full. These cups were quieter, sipped slowly, in a saloon growing dim, while outside the portholes the ocean turned silver with moonlight. Conversation softened, bodies leaned against the benches. The tea cooled, but no one minded. There was something comforting about holding warmth in your hands while the world slipped past in darkness. Tea invited. Confession. You'd hear it in the way people spoke after a second cup. Stories of lost farms, missed letters, the ache of leaving siblings behind. There were long silences too, but not awkward. Just full. And in those moments, you understood that tea wasn't really about taste. It was about time. Time to sit. To share. To breathe. To remember that, even in the crowded belly of a steel ship bound for the unknown, someone had poured you something warm. You returned to your bunk each night with the scent of tea still in your fingers. It lingered long after sleep took you. In dreams, it was sometimes joined by the soft clink of mugs, the hush of steam, and the knowledge that tomorrow, at breakfast, another cup would be waiting. Simple, reliable, human, and in a world of 2. Many changes too fast, perhaps that was the most precious drink of all. Evening on the Titanic arrived quietly in third class. There were no sunsets visible from F-deck, no orange light shimmering on water, no sky stretching into hues of lavender and gold. That kind of poetry belonged to the promenade decks above, to the strollers in first class, to the passengers sipping cordials while the band played something wistful. Down here, in the belly of the ship, night came differently. It came with the dimming of electric bulbs, the hush of activity, and the growing stillness in the corridors. But most of all, it came with supper. If breakfast was the promise of a new day and lunch was the reward for a journey already halfway done, then supper in Steerage was a kind of lullaby, a closing ritual, soft and repetitive to help you settle into the night. You heard it first in the clatter of trays being set, the low murmur of voices as stewards prepared the saloon. Then came the familiar ring of the bell, echoed like a heartbeat in the narrow hallway outside your cabin. You walked, slowly this time, not because you were tired, though you were, but because you didn't want to rush the last shared moment of the day. The dining saloon was quieter than usual, the light a little lower, the air a little thicker with warmth and scent. The tables were already filling with familiar faces. Nora Quinn, the Irish widow with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Henrik Olsson, the quiet Swede with his hands folded in front of him as though preparing for church. The Hungarian baby, wide-eyed in her sling, watched everything as if it were a new kind of dream. Supper was humble. It usually was. No stew tonight. No thick soup or meat with gravy. Instead, there were boiled potatoes, soft and fragrant, dusted lightly with salt. A thick slice of cabin bread, still warm in the center. A piece of cheese, sharp and crumbly, wrapped in wax paper. And of course, the ever-faithful mug of tea. No one complained. After a long day, this was all you needed. You ate slowly. Bread in one hand, tea in the other. Someone across the table offered a pinch of salt. Another passed a pat of butter they'd saved from breakfast. Around the room, the sound of chewing and sipping mixed with the occasional sigh, not of discontent, but contentment. The saloon felt like a hearth then, not flashy, not ornate, but glowing with human warmth. Occasionally, someone would break into song, not loudly, not with bravado, but softly, just a verse or two, a lullaby from their village. A hymn half remembered. One man hummed a Swedish folk tune, and Henrik joined in by tapping the rhythm gently on the table. Nora, after some coaxing, sang a line of something Gaelic. Her voice was worn but strong. No one spoke while she sang. No one even moved. When she finished, there was no applause, just silence and a nod from a man across the room who had tears in his eyes. Even the children who had spent the day running and laughing grew quiet after supper. They curled up on benches, heads resting in mothers' laps or tucked into corners. Their crumbs trailed across the floor like tiny trails to their dreams. You finished your tea and held the mug between both hands. It was still warm, the last. Sip rich and slightly bitter. Beside you, Henrik leaned in and said, "The stars are out somewhere." You nodded. You couldn't see them, not from down here, but you knew they were there, above the steel, above the smoke, above the polished railings and upper decks, far beyond the reach of lanterns or laughter, quiet and cold and eternal. You imagined them, if only for a moment. The North Star, the Dipper, Orion's Belt, constellations from storybooks, from your grandfather's voice, from nights spent in fields too long ago. You thought, they are watching us now, not in judgment, not in warning, just watching, quiet and steady like old friends who never speak but always stay. The stewards began clearing the tables. You helped them, wiping down the wood with a damp cloth, stacking plates, gathering crumbs into your palm. It felt good to care for the space that had cared for you. As the saloon emptied, you lingered, not ready to leave, not just yet. You looked around at the benches now half filled with dozing children, quiet couples, a few solitary souls staring into their mugs. It was a sacred stillness, one you knew would not last forever, but for now, for this one evening, it was enough. You left the saloon with your steps soft on the metal floor. The hallway felt narrower somehow, quieter. You passed your cabin, walked a little further just to feel the ship beneath you, and then you paused. You placed your hand against the cold steel wall, closed your eyes, and listened. There it was. The slow hum of the engines, the faint vibration of power, the deep, living breath of a ship moving through black water, and in your mind's eye, you saw the stars above. Not glittering ornaments for the rich, not metaphors, just stars, watching over even the humblest supper. It's easy to forget them. They never appeared in the passenger lists. Their faces weren't captured in photographs beside polished staircases or grand chandeliers. No memoirs were written from their perspective, but every bowl of soup, every ladle of stew, every crust of bread that passed through the third-class dining saloon was shaped by their hands. They were the cooks, the bakers, the dish boys, the mess stewards, the ones behind the kitchen door. On the Titanic, the culinary operation was a floating machine, massive, coordinated, and constantly in motion. Over 100 kitchen staff worked on board, spread across class lines and duties, but only a portion served the passengers of steerage. Still, what they achieved each day from deep within the heart of the ship bordered on miraculous. The kitchen for third class wasn't some grand galley with copper pots and crystal decanters. It was utilitarian, tucked away below decks, connected to the saloon by a swinging door and a set of well-worn routines. The walls were lined with shelves, stacked high with sacks of flour, potatoes, dried peas, tinned meat, and barrels of pickled vegetables. Nothing was fancy. Everything was practical. The head cook for third class was a man named Donnelly, a stocky Liverpudlian with forearms like bread loaves and a voice that could quiet a rowdy pantry. He'd worked ships for 20 years and claimed he could peel a potato blindfolded. No one doubted him. Each day before sunrise, Donnelly rose and descended into the galley like a captain entering his domain. With him came 3 assistants, 2 junior cooks, and a boy of perhaps 16, whose job was simply to carry water, stoke the fires, and scrub pans until his fingers pruned. The third-class menu may have been modest, but it was consistent. And feeding over 700 people 3 times a day was no small feat. It required timing, precision, and a touch of intuition. The pea soup couldn't be too thin, or it would go cold before it reached the tables. The bread had to be kneaded long enough to survive the damp air and rolling sea. The potatoes had to be peeled by the dozens, sometimes hundreds, each morning. There was no room for error. Inside the kitchen, the air was always warm. Not a comfortable warmth, but the kind that clung to your clothes, curled your hair, and soaked through your sleeves. The oven burned constantly. The steam from vats of porridge fogged up the windows, and the tang of vinegar from the pickling barrels hung stubbornly in the corners. And yet there was music there, not violins or pianos, but the rhythm of ladles, striking pots, of knives tapping against chopping boards, of boots sliding across the slick metal floor. The cooks rarely spoke while they worked. They grunted, nodded, hummed the occasional tune. Communication was done with glances, gestures, and muttered swears when something boiled over. But when the meal was ready, that was different. Donnelly would stand back, surveying his team with a nod. A steward would open the kitchen door, and suddenly the galley would spring to life like a clock winding forward. Trays were loaded, bread was stacked high. Tea was poured into enormous tin pots with handles thick as rope, and the food would go out, carried by stewards who barely noticed the heat anymore. Stewards who knew that if they walked too fast, the tea would spill. If they walked too slow, the soup would congeal. Sometimes, late in the evening after supper had been cleared and the saloon was silent, Donnelly would sit on a stool beside the ovens and remove his cap. His hair would be matted with sweat, his cheeks smudged with flour. He'd rub his hands, cracked from washing, and stare at the flickering lantern as if it held a map of every meal he'd ever made. "Decent lot," he once said aloud, to no one in particular. "Eat what's put in front of them. No fuss." The youngest kitchen boy, scrubbing a pan nearby, looked up. "Do they know it's you making it?" Donnelly chuckled. "Doubt it, and that's how it should be." There was pride in that invisibility. A quiet kind. The cooks of Steerage weren't looking for medals. They weren't crafting soufflés or garnishing roasts. But they understood something sacred. To feed another human being is to say, without words, "I see you." You matter. And they saw the passengers of third class. They saw the boy who always asked for more bread, the old woman who liked her stew thicker, the shy girl who never finished her tea but always whispered thank you. Sometimes the kitchen staff snuck out to the edge of the saloon, pretending to fix a pipe or inspect a hinge just to watch, just to see the food being eaten, the bowls scraped clean, the crumbs wiped with fingers, the satisfied sighs of strangers who had traveled far and still found comfort in a spoonful of potatoes. On the final night before the iceberg, Donnelly instructed his team to fry up extra ham slices. No reason, he said, just a feeling. Let 'em sleep full, he muttered. And they did. Down in steerage, the passengers licked grease from their fingers, shared soft laughs, and leaned back with full bellies, never knowing the names of the men who had stirred the pots, sliced the bread, ladled the stew. But maybe they felt it, in the warmth of their tea, the even seasoning, the simple, satisfying taste of a meal made well. Behind the kitchen door, far from the glamour and glitter of Titanic's upper decks, there was no applause, just the scrape of a pan, the scent of bread still rising, and the steady, sacred act of feeding a ship full of dreams. Food, at its core, is never just food. It is memory. It is language. It is family. It is longing wrapped in scent and warmth. For the immigrants in third class on the Titanic, every mouthful on board was compared quietly and instinctively to something once eaten in a kitchen that smelled like childhood. No matter where they came from, Sweden or Syria, Ireland or Italy, each passenger carried with them, tucked behind the ribs, a memory of a dish that no ship's galley could recreate. Let us begin with bread. The bread in third class was simple, brown, thick, crusty. It filled the belly, wiped up stew, softened in tea. But for many, it was not their bread. A Polish girl named Clara, no older than 17, once held a slice of shipboard bread in both hands and whispered, "It's not rye." Her voice was not angry, not disappointed, just wistful. In her, village bread was dark and sour, made with fermented starter passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter. "Our bread," she explained to a bunkmate, "you can smell across the street." A young Sicilian mason named Luca kept a clove of garlic in his coat pocket, just for the scent. "We put it in everything," he said proudly. "Even the fish, even the beans. Without garlic, it is only sadness." Then there was Jari, a quiet Finnish man with red hands and a low voice, who spoke of karjalan piraka, rice porridge wrapped in rye crust, baked until the edges curled like leaves in the snow. "My mother would send me with 3 in a scarf," he said. "1 for me, 2 to trade." None of these dishes existed aboard Titanic, but in their memories, they were vivid, powerful, alive. Sometimes when a certain scent drifted from the kitchen, onions perhaps or pepper, someone would pause, eyes closing briefly as if transported across oceans. A murmur would rise, smells like mama's soup, or like Easter morning, or like the time the whole village danced because the bread finally rose again. And just like that, they were home. For a moment, between one breath and the next, the metal walls softened. The ship's engine faded, and they were back in the kitchens of wooden houses, in fields with clay ovens, in small apartments above bakeries, places now distant and possibly gone forever. Nora Quinn, the Irish widow you'd dined beside many times, once spoke of colcannon, mashed potatoes with kale and scallions, eaten with a knob of butter in the center. "We'd hide a coin in the pot," she said one night. "Whoever found it first had good luck for a year, unless you broke a tooth." She laughed, but her eyes were glassy. She hadn't had colcannon in years. Still, the memory warmed her more. Then the soup in her bowl. And there were the quiet cooks of memory, those no longer living but whose recipes lived on in the hearts of those sailing west. A Romanian woman with a long braid and a thick wool shawl carried a small cloth book filled with handwritten notes, recipes in looping script, smudged with flour. She read them every evening, lips moving silently, as if the act of reading could cook them into being. Sometimes passengers improvised. They traded bits of food, added herbs smuggled from home, flavored their porridge with apple peel or cinnamon saved from their coat pockets. A small group of Syrians brewed za'atar tea on the sly, crushed from dried leaves tucked into the lining of a suitcase. They sipped it slowly, murmuring in Arabic, passing the mug like a relic. Others tried to teach the ship's fare to behave. Like home, Clara, the Polish girl, soaked a heel of bread in tea and declared it almost like chleb zum mlekiem. Henrik the Swede mixed sugar and oats and told the boy beside him, "This is how we pretend it's dessert." And for the children, even they remembered. A 6-year-old boy named Tomas once told anyone who'd listen that his grandma used to make bolos de maíz, corn cakes with cheese baked inside. "They squeak when you bite them," he insisted, cheeks puffed with pride. Not loud, but enough to hear. Every bite on the Titanic was compared to what had been left behind, not to diminish it, but to tether it, to make the present understandable, to keep the past from slipping away entirely. And yet not all the food memories were joyful. Some remembered hunger, cold broth with no meat, bread too hard to chew, potatoes sprouting before they could be cooked. For them, Titanic's modest meals were a revelation. "I have never had soup 3 days in a row," whispered a Lithuanian boy, astonished. "Not even in summer." Even tea, plain strong brown, was luxury, something served daily in a real mug poured by someone else. And perhaps that was the real magic. Not just the food itself, but the act of being served. To sit, be handed a bowl, to feel the heat on your fingers and know, someone made this for me. It bridged the distance between what was lost and what was hoped for. In every bite, a memory. In every memory, a meal once shared with someone who mattered. And in every meal aboard Titanic, a chance to feel, if only for a moment, that home wasn't gone. It was simply waiting, somewhere across the sea. It was the little things that surprised them. Not chandeliers or champagne, not string quartets or 10-course menus. No, those belonged to another world, one of bow ties and lace gloves, of invitations and whispered privilege. In third class, luxury came in smaller packages, sometimes in the form of a pat of butter, a spoonful of jam, or, on one rare and remarkable day, an orange. You remember it clearly. The morning began like any other. Porridge, bread, tea, familiar, comfortable. But as you sat at the table, quietly sipping from your chipped enamel mug, a steward approached, holding a tray. And on that tray were small white dishes. Each held a pat of butter, no bigger than a coin, pale gold and shaped like a flower. There was a moment of silence. One of the children gasped, too loud. His mother shushed him, but the steward only smiled and placed the dish gently in front of her. You watched amazed as he moved from table to table, distributing butter like it was a sacred rite. Nora, seated beside you, blinked as hers arrived. "Real butter," she whispered. "Not lard, not sweet. Real." She didn't spread it immediately. No one did. They stared at it for a while, this strange, glossy indulgence, almost afraid it might melt into a dream and disappear. Then slowly, reverently they began. Bread was broken, butter was spread. It melted just slightly into the warmth, softening the crust, slicking fingers with sheen, and when it reached your tongue, it was everything. Creamy, salty, almost sweet. It tasted like Sunday, like holidays, like being remembered. There were no speeches, no toasts. But in the hush that fell across the dining saloon, you felt something shift. A rare gift had been given. Later that day, at lunch, the second surprise arrived. Jam, not marmalade, which had made an appearance before, tart and orangey. No, this was strawberry, sweet, red, fragrant, dolloped onto your plate like a secret. The boy across from you poked at it with his spoon. "Is it blood?" he asked, half joking, half hopeful. "No," said Henrik, the ever-sturdy Swede. "It's summer." He said it so calmly, so confidently, that everyone laughed. Indeed, it tasted like summer. The sweetness of sun-ripened fruit, the faint memory of bees and fields and sticky fingers. One girl giggled as it stained her bread pink. A toddler smeared it across his cheek and grinned proudly. An older man dipped his knife cautiously as though afraid to take too much, and then, after one taste, scooped a second helping without shame. It wasn't just jam, it was joy. Unexpected, unlooked for, and yet deeply needed. But it was the orange that would be remembered the longest. It came on the fourth day. You hadn't heard any announcements, hadn't seen it mentioned on the kitchen board. But suddenly, without warning, each table received a bowl, and inside the bowl, sitting like treasure against dull enamel, was a small, round, perfectly ripe orange, one per person. Not a segment, not a slice, a whole orange. Gasps were audible. One woman crossed herself. Another whispered, "I haven't seen one since I was a child." Oranges were not common among the poor in 1912, especially not whole ones, especially not at sea. They were rare, delicate, imported things. Most third-class passengers had only tasted them once or twice in their lives, at Christmas perhaps, or handed out by a kind priest during a holiday feast. You held yours in your palm, marveling. It was cool to the touch, smooth, with a tiny green leaf still clinging to the stem. You brought it to your nose and inhaled deeply. The scent was bright and clean, like waking up early in spring. No one rushed to peel it. People waited, savoring the anticipation. Some made a small cut with a knife. Others dug in with their thumbs, juice squirting slightly, laughter bubbling up with the citrus. The first taste? Shockingly sweet, with just enough tartness to make your eyes blink. It ran down chins, dripped onto cuffs, stained napkins. But no one minded. Children giggled with juice mustaches. Adults licked their fingers like they'd forgotten manners. Even the stewards seemed to move slower, smiling as they watched. And for that brief moment, orange in hand, juice on lips, you felt rich. Not in gold. Not in jewels, but in delight. Pure, childlike, wordless delight. Later, Nora confessed she had wrapped the rind in a cloth and tucked it in her satchel. "To remember," she said. Henrik dried his orange peel on the radiator in the cabin, intending to use it as sachet. Better than soap, he claimed. A boy tried to plant his seeds in a tin mug filled with crumbs, convinced he'd grow an orange tree before reaching New York. We laughed. But quietly, we all hoped a little. Because in that orange, in that buttery bread, that sticky jam, was more than flavor. There was kindness. There was surprise. There was the gentle reminder that even the humblest journey could hold treasure. That, in a world of cold decks, gray steel, and unknown futures, someone had thought to give the people of Steerage a piece of fruit. And for that, we were grateful. There was a time each day, just after the evening bell rang but before the dining saloon filled entirely, when the ship seemed to hush itself, like it was listening. The engine still churned, of course. The sea still brushed its sides in gentle, endless rhythm. But within the steel belly of the Titanic, as third-class passengers gathered for supper, something soft and almost holy descended. It began with the clink of forks. Not loud, not metallic or sharp, just the steady, humble music of people preparing to eat. Mugs set down, cutlery aligned, a plate nudged forward, a brief laugh, the clearing of a throat. This was not the noise of a banquet. This was the heartbeat of a community. You sat once more at your usual bench, Nora beside you, wrapping her shawl tighter. Henrik across the table, slowly unwrapping a bit of cloth he'd used to carry leftover bread. Around you, the familiar faces of fellow travelers settling in for another quiet ritual. The stewards came, moving with practiced grace. Tonight's supper was simple again. Boiled rice, a slab of cold meat, likely pork, sliced thin, and a bit of pickled cabbage. Not a feast, perhaps, but more than enough. You watched the meal unfold like you'd watched the sea once. Calm, repetitive, soothing. And then, very faintly, you heard it. Music. Not from the saloon, certainly not in third class. But somewhere above, drifting through the pipes and cracks in the ship's metal bones, it was distant, barely there, just a trace of melody. You paused, spoon in hand. Others noticed it too. Heads tilted, eyes flicked, upward. For a moment, even the children stopped tapping on the tables. A violin, delicate, flowing, followed by what might have been a cello, maybe a piano, echoing from a higher deck. Someone whispered, "The first-class orchestra." Nora smiled softly. "They're practicing." Henrik leaned forward. "They don't know we can hear." It was true. The musicians played not for you, not for third class. They played for ballrooms above, for drawing rooms trimmed in brass and velvet. But sound travels in strange ways on a ship. And tonight, just tonight, a current of melody had found its way down to you. You resumed eating, but slower now. Each bite felt somehow part of the music. Each sip of tea marked the measure. The rhythm of forks and knives echoed the bowstrokes of the violin above. For a few precious minutes, the dining saloon became a concert hall. No one spoke loudly. No one shouted across tables. Conversation softened, adapted to the flow of music. One child began to sway, spoon in hand. Another clapped, lightly, offbeat but sincere. You closed your eyes for a moment and imagined, not chandeliers, not gowns, but this moment, this gathering of workers, mothers, farmers, seamstresses, children, united not by wealth but by warmth, by rhythm, by the strange and beautiful accident of hearing music that was never meant to reach them, and yet, it did. Perhaps the violinist above didn't even know that his melody had seeped into the iron ribs of the ship, found its way down to F-deck, and wrapped itself around 100 ordinary suppers. But it had. The piece ended softly, a long fading note, a pause, then silence. No applause came. It wasn't needed. The music had been a gift, one that asked for nothing and gave everything. The meal continued. Bread was passed. Tea was poured. The pickled cabbage earned mixed reviews. A few grimaces, a few smiles. One man joked that it tasted like a sour dream. Another added that at least it kept your thoughts sharp. Someone began humming. It wasn't the same melody, but close. A lullaby, perhaps. A tune from home. Soon others joined in, not in unison, not as a choir, but as a collection of small, individual echoes. A harmony of memory. The dining saloon glowed dimly. The oil lamps flickered slightly. A steward passed by and paused to listen, mug in hand. He didn't interrupt, just stood there, swaying faintly, before moving on with a nod. It was hard to say when the meal ended. There was no clear signal, no final note. Just a slow rise from benches, the gentle gathering of belongings, the soft scrape of chairs against floor. You stood too. Your belly was full, but so was something else. A kind of stillness. A contentment that didn't come from food alone. It came from the clink of forks, the hush of evening, and the music that had for one moment crossed every boundary aboard the ship. You stepped into the corridor. The air was cooler, the hallway dim, but in your ears a faint melody remained. Not just the notes of the violin, but the sound of togetherness, of tea shared under low light, of voices rising in unplanned harmony, of forks gently clinking in time with the sea. A song, composed not with instruments but with people, and you carried it with you all the way back to your bunk. By midnight, most of the Titanic had gone quiet. The decks were deserted. The great dining rooms had dimmed. The music had ceased. Above, the stars turned slowly over the Atlantic, cold and ancient, unaware of the ship moving beneath them. But below, in third class, a quiet sort of life lingered. It wasn't loud nor busy. It wasn't full of plans or movement, but it breathed. In whispers, in yawns, in the soft crinkle of paper-wrapped biscuits passed from bunk to bunk. Because long after the last supper dish had been cleared, long after the stewards had retired, and the children had drifted into tangled sleep, some passengers still remained awake. Not out of choice always. Sometimes sleep took its time. The ship rocked gently, but the mind did not still so easily. Thoughts stirred. Homesickness arrived like an old neighbor. Dreams refused to settle. And so people lay in their bunks, eyes open, listening, to the hum of pipes, to the muffled cough of a stranger in another cabin, to their own hearts. And that's when the biscuits came out, little treasures, saved from meals or traded quietly in the saloon. Hard, dry things that cracked more than crumbled, but that tasted of comfort when eaten slowly in the dark. They were shared like secrets, one by one, passed from a cloth pouch or coat pocket. No ceremony, no need. Just a soft tap on the bunk. Above or below, a wordless offer, a grateful nod. You received yours from Callum. The Scottish lad had been saving 2 cabin biscuits in a strip of paper torn from a magazine. He passed one down to you with a grin. For the night shift, he whispered. It was plain, dry, a little sweet, but eaten in the hush of night, under the low ceiling of a gently swaying cabin, it tasted like gold. Henrik, the ever-prepared Swede, produced a cube of cheese he'd wrapped in a rag. He sliced it with a pocket knife and offered everyone a sliver. Not good, he said honestly, but sharp enough to wake the tongue. Nora declined food but offered something else. A story. She lay back on her bunk, hands crossed over her chest, and spoke in the dark. Her voice was low, rhythmic, softened by time and memory. Back home, she began, we had a man in our village who could find water by walking with a stick, swore it was magic, held a willow branch bent in a V and walked the fields. When the stick turned, he'd say, dig here, and there'd be a spring every time. No one questioned her. She didn't ask for belief. She was offering company. Henrik responded with his own tale, a legend from the forests of Dalarna, about a man who followed a fox deep into the snow and found a cave filled with mushrooms glowing blue. They say if you eat one, he added, you dream of your wedding night, even if you're not married. That earned a chuckle. Stories continued, some real, some not. A French boy whispered about a haunted mill in his village. A young woman from Sligo swore she once saw a ghost cow walking through a wall. It had no legs, she said seriously. Just hooves floating in the air. You added your own tale, half true, half made, about a cousin who claimed he could speak to fish if you held your breath underwater and thought very hard about anchovies. No one believed it. Everyone laughed, but softly, carefully, so as not to wake the sleeping children or disturb the spell of midnight. Outside, the sea was deep and still. Inside, the biscuits dwindled. The cheese was gone. The stories slowed. Someone yawned. Another adjusted their blanket. The hush began to return. But it wasn't the hush of loneliness now. It was the hush of shared peace, the kind that comes when bellies are warm, fingers are sticky, and strangers have chosen to tell each other things they don't usually share. The kind of quiet that only comes after the lights are out. You rolled onto your side. The bunk creaked slightly. The cabin smelled faintly of tea and wool and a trace of orange peel, long dried and forgotten in someone's pocket. And then in the dark came a final voice. A boy, young, unsure. Do you think we'll make it? He asked. No one answered at first, not because the question was frightening or impossible, but because it wasn't really a question. It was a wish, spoken aloud. Nora whispered, we'll get there, one way or another. Henrik added, ships were made to sail, and you in your own quiet way added nothing. You simply closed your eyes, tucked the last bite of biscuit under your tongue, and let the ocean rock you. Not to sleep, not yet, but toward it. Because tonight you had stories. You had crumbs. You had people who had shared both, and somehow in the dark, that was enough. It's a peculiar human habit to imagine the meals of those above us, not because we are unsatisfied with our own, not because we covet their sauces or silver spoons, but because food, like story, invites curiosity. And when you're below deck, when your bowl holds stew and your tea is strong but plain, it is only natural to wonder, what do they eat up there? In third class aboard the Titanic, such musings were nightly entertainment. No one had seen the first-class dining room save for a few who had glimpsed its carved wood walls and towering glass domes during boarding. Rumors passed like whispers. How many courses were served, what kind of wine was poured, whether waiters in gloves truly bowed before delivering roast duck. At your dinner table, the imagination became theater. Henrik started it, one evening, after a particularly bland piece of boiled pork. "I hear," he said gravely, "they eat swan, with cherries stuffed in the beak." There was a moment of silence. Then Nora, never one to let foolishness pass unchecked, raised an eyebrow. "Swan? Is it, and what do they serve the swan on, a violin?" Henrik grinned. No, a harp." The table laughed, the way only tired, fed people can laugh, freely, openly. And with that, the game began. Each person, in turn, added a detail to the imagined banquet of first class. Callum swore their spoons were made of ice that never melted. The Polish girl insisted the napkins were stitched from silk spun by monks in the Alps. Someone suggested that butter there never needed spreading. It just glided onto the bread by its own will, obedient and rich. Children played too. A boy declared first-class guests drank clouds, served in crystal goblets. Another said the soup arrived in golden eggs, which cracked open at the table, releasing steam scented with cinnamon and stars. Of course, none of this was true. In reality, the first-class diners were served things like filet mignon, oysters, consommé, quail, and aspic. They drank claret and sauternes, and dined under the glow of electric, light on fine china. Their tables were dressed with orchids, their menus printed fresh each day. But those in third class did not know the truth, and perhaps in some way that made their version better. Because in dreaming of the banquets above, the passengers below were not yearning for the food. They were exercising something much more precious, imagination. And imagination, when paired with hunger, is a powerful thing. Sometimes they reenacted the imagined meal. Nora would fold a napkin in her lap and declare in her most elegant tone, "I'll have the goose, please. Extra diamonds on the side." Henrik would pass a stale crust of bread and whisper, "Caviar, imported from Neptune's pantry." Even the stewards joined in on occasion if the mood was right. One young man tasked with delivering biscuits leaned in and said confidentially, "I hear they eat a different fruit for every letter of the alphabet. Ever had a kumquat?" The word itself drew gasps, though no one knew what it meant. A girl, perhaps 9 years old, leaned across the table one night and asked, "Do they eat at all, really? Or just dream food onto their plates?" That stuck with you, because in a way, first class had become a myth, a castle in the clouds, where hunger was not felt, where meals arrived as art, where the diners never chewed, only smiled. You imagined the room, tall ceilings, gilded columns, chandeliers tinkling with laughter. Men in tuxedos, women in dresses so wide they required their own chairs. And in the center a roast beef so perfectly cooked it wept wine when sliced. And then you smiled, because you knew deep down that even the finest meal could not rival what you had. Crumbs shared with friends, jam passed in trust, biscuits at midnight while stories floated in the dark. Luxury, it turned out, had many forms, and not all of them required linen. Still, the dreams continued. They gave passengers something to talk about between meals, something to decorate the days. They were harmless, generous, even humorous. A boy once said, "First class drinks sunlight." His sister replied, "And eats time." You weren't sure what that meant, but it made you laugh, and perhaps that too was nourishment. One night, just before bed, you passed Nora in the hallway. She held a cloth-wrapped bundle in one hand, leftover bread, you guessed, and smiled. "Tell me," she said softly, "what did they have tonight up there?" You thought for a moment, then answered, just as softly, "A feast made of stars, served on silver moons. Dessert was a lullaby." She laughed, shook her head, and walked on. You never asked what she ate that night. It didn't matter, because in third class, meals were real. But dreams were the finest course of all. There was nothing in the air to suggest it would be the last. No flicker in the electric lights. No tremble in the ship's steady heartbeat. No omen drifting in the scent of tea. No shadow crossing the bread. The evening felt like any other. April 14th, 1912, Sunday. By now, the routines of third class had settled into comfort. You knew the path to the dining saloon without thinking. You could guess the menu by scent alone. You recognized the faces at your table, not by name perhaps, but by the stories they had shared and the way they stirred their tea. Supper came after, a quiet day. The sea had been calm, remarkably calm. Like glass, someone had whispered earlier that afternoon, peering through a porthole. Not even a ripple. You'd felt it too. The ship sailed smooth as breath. The absence of motion had become a kind of presence, eerie in its quietness but not frightening. Just still. And so you walked to the saloon that night as you always did. Shoulders relaxed, appetite full, spirit steady. The room welcomed you. Its pale green walls, its flickering lights, its rows of benches that had become familiar. The same hum of voices, the same clatter of cutlery, the same warm murmur of stewards in aprons. Supper was plain. Cabin biscuits, cheese, a slice of cold meat, and once again tea. Nothing extraordinary, except of course it was, because it was the last. But no one knew, and that, perhaps, was its strange perfection. There were no goodbyes, no speeches, no lingering glances, just bread passed politely, jokes shared softly, and crumbs brushed from sleeves. Nora spoke of dreams again, this time not of food, but of Boston. My daughter says the air there smells of coal and bread. It's a good mix, she added, slicing her cheese with careful hands. Henrik, steady as always, offered a strip of dried apple he'd saved from his journey. Tastes like the past, he said. Someone sang, not a full song, just the chorus, of a lullaby. The tune wove itself around the room like candlelight. And you felt calm, the kind of calm that doesn't come often, the kind that isn't dramatic or even noticeable until later, the kind that lives in the bones, like a warm blanket. Outside, the stars were bright, the brightest they'd been so far. Not that you could see them from where you sat, but someone had said so and you believed it. They said the sea was glowing, that the wake of the ship left streaks of blue light. Phosphorescence. Magic, some called it. Science, others corrected, but everyone agreed it was beautiful. You finished your tea slowly, letting the last sip cool on your tongue. The cheese had been sharp, the biscuit dry, but the taste no longer mattered. It was the sharing that counted, the gentleness of the hour, the familiarity of faces. Children yawned. Someone cracked a knuckle. A steward hummed under his breath as he cleared plates, and then, without ceremony, the meal ended. Benches scraped. Mugs were stacked. Good nights were mumbled like soft punctuation marks. You stood, stretched, and turned toward the corridor. Just as you reached the doorway, you glanced back. The saloon was half empty now. A few stayed behind, talking in hushed tones. One woman rocked a child. Another sat alone, her hands still clasped around an empty cup, as if trying to warm herself on memory alone. It looked like any other evening. Ordinary, completely, heartbreakingly ordinary. And that was the grace of it. Because no one knew. No one looked around thinking this is the last time. No one hugged tighter. No one took longer to finish. No one held back a tear or tucked away a final biscuit as if it were a keepsake. They simply lived. Ate, spoke, laughed. That night, back in your bunk, you fell asleep to the same sounds as always. The low hum of the ship's engines. The occasional murmur from the hallway. The creak of bunks as your cabin mates shifted under their blankets. No fear, no prophecy. Just sleep. Pure and unburdened. And if, in the middle of the night, the ship trembled, just slightly, you didn't wake. If someone stirred, opened their eyes, and stared at the ceiling, listening for something that wasn't there, they didn't say a word. They let the silence hold them, let the darkness cradle them. And in the soft belly of the ship, beneath stars they could not see, surrounded by strangers who had become family, they slept, fed content, together. In the days and weeks that followed, after the great ship was gone and the ocean returned to its unbothered rhythm, there were questions. So many questions. Some were loud, poured into newspapers, demanded at inquiry halls, spoken into microphones by men with mustaches and serious brows. But some were quieter, asked in empty kitchens and around cold hearths by those who had loved someone lost. One such question, often unspoken, was this: what was left behind? Not the stories, not the names, but the actual things. The pots, the pans, the plates that never made it to the table. The Titanic's kitchens, including those serving third class, were vast and surprisingly orderly. Designed like an army barracks for food, they ran with clockwork precision. Soup in vats, bread on racks, potatoes in piles, tea in endless streams. But after the iceberg came, after metal scraped ice and the sea came pouring in, there was no more supper to serve. Still, some of it remained. In the accounts of those who later helped to organize salvaging efforts, and in the testimony of surviving crew who had worked the kitchens, a strange, haunting image emerged. The galley below decks, flooded now, fractured, and silent, had been frozen in time, long after the world had shifted. In the third-class kitchen, someone had peeled potatoes just before midnight. They were still in the bucket. Pale crescents slick with water, waiting for the next day's soup. A pan of rice had been set aside to cool, not yet served. Covered loosely with a cloth, its surface had set like custard by the time the water found it. A loaf of bread, half sliced, remained on a cutting board. The knife was still resting beside it. Stewards rushing to their posts had left trays stacked near the service door. One bore mugs of tea, still full, undelivered. Another held biscuits wrapped in cloth, likely meant for a table of children who had asked nicely. These were not artifacts in the museum sense. They were not gold or silver, not jewels or china. They were quieter things. Crumbs and steam, interrupted. One steward, a young man named James from Southampton, had survived. He'd worked the third-class service corridor and told reporters later that as he ran from his post, the only thing he remembered was the smell of onions frying. "I thought," he said softly, "what a thing to smell, just before it ends." Another, a galley boy, barely 16, said he'd been sent to fetch butter and never made it back. "I left the dish by the stove," he recalled. "It was softening. The absurdity of it haunted him. Butter softening while the ship broke apart." A French cook from second class who'd once passed through the third-class kitchen during a quiet moment remembered seeing a single orange on the counter. One last piece from the unexpected gift handed out the day before. "I wonder," he said, "if anyone got to eat it." In the records from the British Board of Trade Inquiry, no official mention is made of food. No documentation of stew or bread or leftover cheese. But the stewards remembered. The kitchen boys remembered. And in their stories, passed down to family members or scribbled in the margins of old letters, the kitchen remained. Not as a place of panic, but as a place of pause. A place where the ordinary had waited for morning, never knowing it would not come. Even years later, when expeditions descended to the wreck, deep in the black water, far beneath sunlight, they found echoes of these meals. Dishes still stacked, spoons in drawers, pans resting neatly where someone had left them. And though the food was long gone, devoured by sea and time, the shape of it remained. An indentation in a tray. A scratch in the metal where a knife had worked too fast. The placement of a mug, tilted just so, as though its owner had stepped away for a moment and would return. There is something unbearably human about that. The belief that the ordinary continues, that a half-sliced loaf will still be there in the morning, that tea will be poured, that biscuits will be served again, and while the world outside cracked and froze, while wood splintered and voices rose, while water swallowed steel and song, the kitchen stayed behind, for one moment longer. Still, warm, waiting, in my memory. It lives even now, not as tragedy, but as testimony. To the hands that peeled potatoes, to the butter left softening, to the tea that never got cold, because someone never came back to drink it. If you listen closely, not just with your ears, but with that part of your spirit that holds silence gently, you might still hear them. The echo of footsteps on metal stairs, the creak of benches beneath tired bodies, the clink of mugs, enamel, chipped from use, set gently onto wooden tables. The third-class dining saloon aboard the Titanic no longer exists. The walls are gone, the benches long, vanished into ocean darkness. The bread has crumbled. The tea gone cold over a century ago, and yet in memory the room remains warm. It's easy when we speak of the Titanic to think only of marble and music, of crystal chandeliers and grand staircases. But history, like hunger, is rarely that grand. It lives in the ordinary, in the shared, in the small, and nowhere was that more true than in the meal served far below deck. This story we've shared together, over 21 parts, over bowls of porridge and slices of cabin bread, over midnight biscuits and imagined banquets, has not been about tragedy. It has been about presence, the presence of life where few had looked before, of meaning in a spoonful of stew, of dignity in a slice of cheese, of comfort in a chipped mug, of strong tea. Let us return just once more to that long, pale green room, the room filled with people whose names were not printed in the upper ledgers, who brought with them no tuxedos, no lace fans, no steamer trunks lined in silk, only hope and memory and a hunger for something better. They sat elbow to elbow. They shared what they had. They folded napkins carefully and taught each other how to say thank you in 7 languages. They sang. They laughed. They split oranges and passed jam. They told stories, and they ate with gratitude, with grace, with the quiet strength of people who had faced hardship and still believed in the promise of the next meal. History forgot their menus, but not their meals. We remember them now. We remember Nora Quinn, Irish widow with a sharp tongue and a soft heart, folding butter into her bread with reverence. Henrik Olsen, the silent Swede, whose dreams of farmland found brief pause in a bite of apple or the heat of cabbage soup. Callum, the lad from Dundee, who dunked his biscuit in tea with the joy of a boy discovering stars. The children who licked jam from their thumbs and believed biscuits could bloom into trees. And you, quiet observer, humble traveler, who sat among them, listening. Maybe, not in person, but in heart. And now let us raise a final cup, not of wine or champagne, but of tea. Strong, bitter, honest. Hold it in your hands. Close your eyes and say, with no need for grandeur, just a whisper, to the crumbs, the laughter, and the little joys at sea. A toast to the meals no one photographed, to the tables no one praised, to the bell that called them home 3 times a day until the very end, and to the kitchen behind the door, where bread still rose, unseen. Good night, fellow traveler. May your dreams be warm. May your tea stay strong, and may the sea wherever it finds you be kind.